Tansy Hoskins on footwork. And let me just say, I have known, oh God, I don't know how long I've known Tansy. We've known each other for a very, very long while. We've been friends for a very, very long while. And Tansy has always had a great interest in, I know, what is happening in the global south, and has been building a career as a journalist and a writer concerned with what is actually happening in the global south and the new forms of globalized exploitation that are developing. She wrote, and we worked quite closely on this together actually, because it came out as a left book club. Tansy's first book was on the fashion industry more generally, and now this book, the latest book, is looking specifically about how we can use the production, presumably the production, the distribution, the sale of shoes as a kind of almost like a case study, really, in the way in which modern globalized capitalism works. So, Tansy, over to you. The floor, as it were, is yours. Everybody keep muted, and away you go, Tansy.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Neil. And yeah, Neil's right. He played an absolutely key part in the creation of my first book, Stitched Up, which is all about the global fashion industry. And I mean, I can imagine, like, at the moment that maybe, you know, some of you potentially are sitting there kind of thinking, oh, why do I need to sit through a talk about the fashion industry and about, you know, the shoe industry, and like that, you know, these are not things that interest me. But I think it's really important that partly that the left engages in cultural issues like fashion. Otherwise, we really just leave it open to either just to right-wing kind of free market neoliberal politics, or to just a really kind of pathetic liberal take on the whole thing. So just, you know, where people are just encouraged to shop differently as a way of changing the world, which is the issue that comes up time and time again. And I think I've done pretty well as a voice in the global garment industry, in the fashion industry, because there are literally tens of thousands of people, and in particular young women, who are interested in fashion and dress and design, but also very aware that there is something very badly wrong with the world and with the system, but aren't quite sure exactly what's going on. And so often, they come to fashion and fashion activism as it's the sort of gateway drug into other movements and into learning about anti-imperialism and capitalism. And another reason I think it's really important that we have these conversations at the moment, in particular, is because the garment industry is really one of the worst and most exploitative industries at the moment, and everything that happens and the exploitation that happens in the garment industry and the shoe industry is being massively intensified by COVID-19. And you literally, I mean, there's about 60 million workers within the global garment, footwear, and textile industry, and they are literally faced with the decision of go to work and risk infection, or stay at home and starve, and it really literally is that extreme a choice, and time again we've seen really awful outbreaks of COVID-19 happening within the garment industry. So there was a case in May in Guatemala where in a maquila, in a factory in Guatemala, where about an estimated 200 people, 200 garment workers were infected with COVID-19 because this Guatemalan factory had refused to close down and had refused to activate any kind of social distancing or safety for workers. And this is literally how people are treated. There was another thing that's incredibly worrying is that there's a report that was released just recently, which is saying that the risk of bonded labour and modern day slavery has absolutely spiked, like due to COVID-19. And the two industries that are particularly highlighted as being at the most risk for bonded labour and slavery now in 2020 were the agricultural industry and the garment industry. So any I think any kind of idea that the garment industry and the shoe industry is somehow like fluffy or not worth our attention, is completely ridiculous. And again, the ITUC has just released its findings, which says that labour rights violations are now at a 7-year high, again as a result of COVID-19. And one of the countries that they have highlighted as being one of the worst countries in the world for labour rights violations is Bangladesh, which is right at the heart of the global garment industry. The four countries are Bangladesh, Colombia, Egypt, and Honduras. So in fact, Egypt has a large textile and garment industry as well. But yeah, Bangladesh is now listed as one of the worst countries in the world for labour rights violations, and that is where I pretty much guarantee that some of the clothes that we are all wearing right this second, although I can't see everyone on Zoom, so hoping you're all wearing clothes, but that some of the, or some, if not all of the clothes that we're wearing at the moment were made in Bangladesh. So it's never, for me, it's never been a more important issue than it is now. And if we don't, if we're not in the room having the argument with people, then I don't think we'll ever see change within the fashion, textile, and clothing and footwear industry. So that's my rant about why you should be interested in this issue, particularly at the moment. I thought it'd be good if I do just a quick rundown about shoes in particular, because obviously I've just got this new book out, and it's based on a lot of original research that I did in the global south, and particularly in Eastern Europe and Macedonia. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of all about shoes and the particular exploitation. So it's thought that human beings have been wearing shoes for about 40,000 years. So there's a paleoanthropologist called Eric Trinkhaus, and it's him that thinks he's leading this research that says, we've been wearing them for about 40,000 years. And obviously there's not a lot of archaeological evidence around from 40,000 years ago. And the things people were making shoes from was bark and reeds and stuff. So it's all disappeared. So what Trinkhaus has done is study people's toes. And what he found is that human beings have very sturdy toes before 40,000 years. And then after 40,000 years, there's a softening of the toes, which he has put down to the splinting that you get from the wearing of footwear. So that's the theory anyway. And we are the only species on the planet to regularly wear foot coverings in order to protect our feet from stones on the ground or insect bites or ice or boiling hot deserts and so on. So 40,000 years. And to be honest with you, the creation of shoes, the shape of shoes has not really changed very much. They're still it's essentially a sole and an upper, which is then bonded together. And for hundreds and thousands of years, shoes were a very, very locally made object. So they'd be made by an individual expert in a small locality. So the village, typically the village shoemaker. And there's a really lovely chapter in an Eric Hobsbawm book, which is all about the radicalism that was traditionally found amongst shoe workers. And so there's just like so many records from right across Europe of radical movements, either like people who were arrested or pamphlets about people, and over and over and over again, it's shoemakers who were like the village radical, and this has kind of been put down to it being, partly this is it was an easy industry to get into. It was a very low cost industry. It's quite an easy industry to do. It's not agricultural work. You're not like lugging sacks of flour around or anything like that. You're sat at a table all day long, so you have the capacity to keep thinking all day long. And it's also a very sociable job. So typically you would be working with other people in the workshop, and you'd have other villagers coming and going the whole time. So, the shoemaker is at the heart of the village, probably quite gossipy, meeting people coming and going, like learning the latest political thought of the time, and acting as a kind of village councillor. And so there's this tradition of radicalism amongst shoemakers, which is really pretty special. But that was, of course, all wiped out with industrialisation, because while the way shoes look hasn't changed that much, the way that they are made has completely changed. And so to the point where now the shoe industry is just a mighty industrial monster, to the point that in 2018, 66.3 million pairs of shoes were made every single day. And this came about, this process is just so completely linked to the rise of industrial capitalism, this rise of machines which just wiped out the village shoemaker, wiped out the idea of shoes as like a handcrafted object or something that that a single person would make with along with their family. And so people basically got to the point where there's no way in hell they could keep up with a machine which could make 100 pairs to my one pair, there's a Pete Segal song about that point in industrial history. So shoes, 66.3 million pairs of shoes adds up to a total of 24.2 billion, and they were one of the first objects to undergo globalized production, as it became obvious, that these multinational corporations, companies like Nike and Adidas and Reebok and Clarks and Dr. Martens, it became obvious that they didn't need to have them made by specialists in Britain, that they could go to Mexico and China and Thailand and places like that, and be able to pay people extraordinarily low wages and circumvent any kind of environmental safety as well. So China remains the number one spot for shoemaking. In 2018, China made 64.7% of all shoes, and there's just no other country in the world that comes even close to making that number of shoes. Other key producing countries, you've got Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, India and Pakistan, Mexico and Brazil. But there's no European country that is any longer in the top 10 shoemaking countries of the world. And interestingly and very worryingly, and this is something I wrote about quite a lot in the book, is that Ethiopia has recently been established as a shoemaking hub, because brands, continuing as wages have increased incrementally in China, brands are now looking for even cheaper places to get their shoes produced. And Ethiopia has the lowest baseline minimum wage for the garment and shoe and textile industry in the entire world. And it's a minimum baseline wage of $26 per month, which is just like extraordinarily low, and it's not possible. You talk to anyone in Ethiopia, it's not possible to have a good life, a safe, decent life on $26 per month. And Eastern Europe is a key site of production for shoes, which are then exported to the rest of Europe. And like one thing I would encourage you to do after the meeting, just and out of interest to yourself, is like just have a look in your own shoes and just see like what's the if you're lucky you'll have a little like a country printed on there. And I just think it's always interesting just to see like these are things that we don't normally kind of think about. It's like what shoe, what country was your shoe made in? Was it Macedonia? Was it China? Was it Thailand or Ethiopia? So one of the big problems that comes from that scale of production, and this is really like a problem that I think that people are becoming more aware of, but it's also a problem that we're really building up for the future, is that we're making 66.3 million pairs of shoes a day, and 90% of these shoes are not being recycled. And there's various reasons for that. And like this, again, like so much within this industry, it just comes down to corporate greed and like a total lack of regulation on these multinational giants. And essentially, it's really difficult to recycle a shoe. They can be made from 30 to 40 different component parts. The parts are, plastics, foams, oil-based plastics, rubber, cotton, and metal, like either metal shanks along the bottom or like metal bits on your laces or the eyelets for the laces. And so you get these 30 to 40 different materials, and then what happens when you make a shoe in a factory is that you bond them together really, really tightly. And so when it comes to recycling, it's just really difficult to recycle a shoe. It's really difficult to take these different pieces apart, and then it's really difficult to separate all the different pieces out. And because they have metal in them, it's really hard. Like it's just very difficult to shred them. And the other problem is that like a shoe is a really low value object. Like it's not like a circuit board where where whoever recycles it can get some gold or some copper or something useful out of it. Like this is just like shreds of old leather and foam and so on. So we are building up this giant problem for ourselves in that like we're making 24 billion pairs of shoes every year. We're not able to recycle them. And they're going to landfill or they're going to be incinerated, which is extraordinarily dangerous for us as a species, as we know, and for the planet as a whole. Another really awful environmental problem with the shoe industry is the production of leather. And I feel like people don't think that or don't connect their shoes with the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, for example. But the number one cause of deforestation in the Amazon rainforest is cattle farming. And of course, within Brazil, this is cattle for export, and this is cattle for meat and for leather as well. So, our shoes are intrinsically linked to this really, this environmental crime which is happening and which has intensified massively with the election of Bolsonaro as well. And then further down the leather supply chain, in Bangladesh, for example, the chemical process involved with turning animal skin into leather, has spelt absolute disaster. And the tannery industry in Bangladesh created the 5th most polluted place on the planet. And this is because, to turn skin into leather is an extremely chemically intensive process. So they use chromium, including chromium-6, which if you've seen the brilliant film Erin Brockovich, you'll know is hexavalent chromium. sulfur dioxide, formic acid, ammonium chloride. And one of the most horrible statistics that I found for when I was writing the book is that the danger of this leather production is so bad that a tannery worker in Bangladesh working with these chemicals has a 90% chance of being dead by the age of 50. Like that's how dangerous and damaging these chemicals are. And of course, these are very much shoes, and this is leather for export. And it's led to entire rivers in Bangladesh being declared biologically dead. The last thing, I'm sort of rattling through a list of like a horror show of the shoe industry, but I think the last thing I wanted to mention is what's happening in Turkey, because this is just an issue that is really not going away, and is one where Europe and the European Union is absolutely is very much responsible for. So one of the things I try and do, and one of the things I am interested in clothing and footwear, is because they are objects that can tell us a bigger story about capitalism and about globalization and about the world and the system that we live in, and try and get the stories out of these objects, and want to ask these objects what they can tell us about where they came from, and also I like to try and give a platform to the people who made these objects as well. And behind the shoe industry, there are some really awful labour rights abuses taking place. In the book, I talk a lot about home workers. It's a huge informal sector that's a pillar of the shoe industry. But one of the worst stories is from Turkey, and so there's 2.5 million employees working in Turkey in textiles and clothing and footwear, and about half of them are informal workers. And since the war in Syria broke out, obviously millions of people flooded over the border into Turkey, and have been stuck there. And in order to have a roof over their head and to put food on the table, many Syrian families have taken the decision to send their children into this industry, with the result that Syrian refugee children as young as 6 years old have been found stitching shoes together in basement workshops in Turkey, and the conditions are absolutely shocking. And there has been a lot of coverage around the garment industry, and since the collapse of the Rana Plaza factory building in Bangladesh in 2013, there's been quite a strong spotlight on the clothing industry, but it hasn't been applied in the same way to the shoe industry. And so you get things like this happening. And so, you've got these kids and they're 6 years old. They start work at 7 o'clock in the morning. They work through until 10 p.m. They're working with toxic glue. They're working with cutting knives. They're working with flammable solvents. They work for these gang masters and workshop owners, and they face everything you can imagine. So physical abuse, mental abuse, emotional, sexual abuse. It's a horrible environment for an adult, let alone for a child. But it's literally, it's what Engels was documenting, in the Victorian era, with where the factory bosses want to hire these children because they've got small fingers. And they can stitch neatly, and then they can pay them an absolutely hideous wage of about £25 to £30 a month. And again, it's important to note that these are shoes for export. So these are shoes that are coming to Britain and to Italy and to Germany. And one of the things that really struck me as a particularly cruel irony is that these shoes, the kids make these shoes, and they get boxed up beautifully, and then they, off they go across the border into Britain or Germany or Italy. But the children, these desperate children who have done this stitching, that border is closed to them. And it's just that, it's the way, for me, it's like how shoes tell you that story about how capital and objects are valued and allowed to flow across borders and are valued above the lives of these 6-year-old children. And so I think that's why it's often useful to look at things like shoes and clothing, because there's a lot of big questions about capitalism, but I think that the simplest ones often just hold the key. And for me, there's a lot of simple questions in the footwear industry. It's like, is it worth destroying the rainforest to make trainers? Is it right that factories are churning out 24 billion pairs of shoes, and yet wealth is distributed so unequally that tens of thousands of kids get sick walking barefoot to school? Is that right? Should people tanning leather have a life expectancy of 50? And should 6-year-olds be working in basement workshops stitching shoes? And I think that's where you can really reach people who maybe aren't into a lot of political ideas. It's if you know in your heart that the answer to those questions is no, then it's like, well, what are we doing in a system where that says the answer is yes? And so I found that this is a useful way of talking to people, not just about shoes and clothes, but about globalization and refugee rights and capitalism and exploitation.